place. And I think Rob is one of the people who has actually made some rather concerted effort over quite a period of time to illustrate this point. And a great deal of his work for the last 20 years or so has been concerned with questions of which I guess this Eugenification project is a very good example. He ran a project in Canada for quite a long time, which was concerned with unearthing the history of basically eugenics as directed against Native Canadian First Nation peoples. And he's also worked on this topic in Australia and has also come up with some things we probably rather not know, but some of the history of our countries. But that certainly we should know, given that it's probably true. But anyhow, so today he's talking something that very much related to this very important strand of work. And he'll talk about human individuality through eugenification. We're looking forward to hearing talk about that. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the second time that I've been in Exeter. I was here for the 2007-ish, which that's when it was.
All right.
And also just want to acknowledge John for, all the kind words, but also if there's anything that you really disagree with what I have to say, yes, basically a lot of it goes back, it's John's fault. Because when I ventured from cognitive science, see, I worked in philosophy of mind and the cognitive sciences in the first 5 to 10 years of my career, and then because my job was officially in logic and philosophy of science, neither of which I'd studied in graduate school when I was teaching at Queen's, I ventured into philosophy of biology. And the first thing I wrote was this paper called Promiscuous Realism, which was a critique of John's stuff, and then he wrote a reply to that and BJPS. And that kind of got me thinking, as opposed to philosophy of mind and cognitive science, philosophy of biology is actually a pretty nice place to hang out. The people were kind and generous even when you disagreed with them. People like Kitcher and Hull wrote back to me when I did a little know-nothing person sent it to them, and they were just inviting. Elliot Sober as well was another person that mixed. I couldn't imagine doing that with Jerry Fodor or something like that. So thanks for that sort of start, but yeah, it's just. So I also wanted to acknowledge the funding that I've had for the last few years from the Australian Research Council for this project Keeping Kinship in Mind, which has allowed me to finish this book, which I'll talk about. It's not the focus of the talk, but I do want to talk about a little bit. As of last night, I'd thrown out all the stuff that was on this kinship book from the early versions of the talk. Now, when I was looking through the faculty list a bit more, I thought, oh, there's probably a good chance there might be some 4A people here, and they might like to be interested in that connection between between the earlier work and cognitive science and extended cognition, and what I at least see as a connection to thinking about philosophy and social sciences, particularly anthropology, particularly on kinship. So I've thrown those back in. The talk itself and the term eugenification originated after I was invited by Pierre Gourat last year at Macquarie to come to a conference a workshop that he did 2 days, very intensive, a lot of so-called high-powered European science types working on evolutionary transitions came over. And I really hadn't been thinking about this stuff for a long time. I was really thinking about eugenics still. And so I thought, what can I do? How can I kind of meld what I'm interested in and what they might be willing to tolerate? So that's how it started. And since then, you'll see I've done, at least I'm going to tell you that I've done a lot of other stuff around this concept of eugenification. Also, just want to acknowledge I also have an appointment at the African Centre for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science as of the last year or so. And I haven't been out there yet, but I'm looking forward to being in Johannesburg to work with a much more epistemically diverse environment than I'm used to in my current home department. So Bill Imtova heads that centre, and I'll also be doing some work with Pila Missamang on the sort of intellectual origins of apartheid. We're planning to do that work coming up Stellenbosch Breeze. So I might get there January, February, might not be until later in the year, but I'm kind of excited about that. So I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, Indigenous elders, because the land that I work on is down here. It's roughly, that little area there is roughly twice the size of England, and it's the home of the Whadjuk Noongar people, Whadjuk people are around, mostly around this sort of one river. Noongar is the broader name for people in that southwestern area. They're the traditional owners. They live on unceded land that was conquered and never been subject to any sort of treaty, unlike what happened in Canada. And I think we need to acknowledge that and remember that. So what I'm going to do, three sorts of things. I'm going to try and briefly introduce this work on what I'm calling kin matters, and I'll focus on the stuff in the middle of this book on incest avoidance. And I'll try and tie it loosely to this idea of norming individuality, which is normally the focus of the talk. Then what I'll do is I'll step back and try and provide the context, drawing on this literature, which many of you will know stems from at least this pair of books. I've just listed a couple of them, one by Leo Doss from '87, The Evolution of Individuality, and then there's Maynard Smith, Seth Murray, book Major Transitions and Evolution from '95. So this is literature that you get individuality in that first title, you don't get it in the second, the transitions, but somehow these have come together to talk about evolutionary transitions in individuality. And I'm particularly going to be focusing on the sort of last bit of these stages of transitions, these 8 transitions that Maynard Smith and Seth Murray talk about for what I want to do. So I'm not going to, it's a bit of a cheat. I'm talking about the bit of the transitions literature, which is really tangential to most of the people in the literature. But it's the one that's perhaps understandably I'd see is connecting up with this process of eugenification. So I'm going to try and set the scene for that. And what I'm going to be, the sort of nominal thesis is I'm going to suggest there are these distinctive practices of what I'm calling norm individuality, which have a kind of historical resonance, and I think are quite important in shaping up the actual societies that we live in now, that stand in at least minimally a bit of tension with the ways in which people in this literature are thinking about this kind of final or next or whatever recent transitions to do with human sociality. So I'm going to try and introduce this idea of eugenification, say what it is quite a way into the talk, but hopefully it will be intuitive enough what I mean, even if you have lots of questions about what its boundaries are and what it includes and excludes and so on, and we can talk about that. So the overall aim of the kin matters book is to try and work across these fragile sciences, which is just my name for biological, cognitive, and social sciences, because we don't otherwise have a term. As John had said, it's in the title Individual and Fragile Sciences. Both these books, they were written as one book. I split into 2 when I realized that each of them would be 300 pages. And some chapters moved between them when I did the final revisions, so they really were one in some sense. It was a sign that they were more unified because they could move seamlessly. A couple of chapters that were initially on group selection for group minds from the genes book into the boundaries book, and they're the last 2 chapters there now. And my thinking in kin matters, as the name suggests, I didn't keep individual, and I hadn't really noticed until I lined these 3 book covers up together that they're almost the same, individual and fragile sciences, relational beings, fragile sciences. I'm very happy with relational beings being in there, even if it disturbs the kind of harmony in moving across the subtitles there. And there's roughly a 20-year gap between these, and there's a reason why I wasn't just sleeping the whole time. I did other things, including working on this book and the project that John talked or alluded to earlier on. So 2018, I published the Eugenic Mind Project, which was came from my work working with survivors of eugenic sterilization in Canada. And I'll say a little bit, one thing I have cut out of the talk is talking more about the Canadian eugenics thing, because once I start on that, it's easy to lose another 10 or 15 minutes in the talk. And I'll be trying my best to stay on 45 to 50 minutes or something like that. But you'll see that this is relevant. So that intervened, that project really between the mid-2005, 2006, when I thought I'd just sit down when I had a few spare afternoons and knock out this 3rd volume. Didn't quite work out like that, and then I was off and running with a community-oriented project that ended up running about 80 public events over 5 to 6 years, building a database with 900 articles, blah, 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 there's a lot. But I'll get to a little snippet of that later. What in particular, the particular view is not just on the slide, just say I'm going to provide a general account of what I'm calling kin matters, okay? But I've got something more specific in mind. I'm going to provide what I call a progenitive account. And that just means an account in which reproduction is central, roughly speaking. Okay, and reproduction like notions of genealogy, biology, which have been sort of missing from a lot of the kinship literature. And I'm trying to do that by relying on some sort of non-reductive tools of the trade that came up earlier in this book. So I'll just give you some examples of these. From Boundaries of Mind, the book is really sustained rejection of individualism about the mind and the cognitive sciences, where individualism is the view that the psychologically explanatory properties in any serious science of the mind have to supervene on the intrinsic physical properties of the individuals that have those states. So sometimes it's called methodological solipsism, and it structures these debates with the Putnam, Twin Earth. If you're in this field, you know it. I'm not going to rehearse it. If you're not in it, too bad, you missed the bus. But more positively, what emerged was not just the rejection of individualism, but this positive view that's often goes under the 4E heading. And I have my favorite E. It's extended. We can argue about that over beers about why that might be. Andy Clark and I wrote a paper. Now it's probably time ago, I guess, more than 15 years ago, where we tried to talk about distributed cognition and use or situated cognition was in the volume of situated cognition. We tried to use cognitive extension as the primary notion. So I first started writing on this in my PhD thesis. Was under the heading of white computationalism. Published a paper on that in mine, and then that folded into my first book. Whereas the idea that in these books I call it locational individualism, whereas the location of the cognitive system is no longer inside the head. It's not just how we taxonomize and talk about it. The actual system, the physical realizes. So I did the metaphysics, had wide realizations, right? That was the idea early on there. So that's an important part here. And the other part is holding on to a part of the natives' views, which I think are very strongly represented in the cognitive sciences, but not the whole of them. So not these, what I call strong nativist views, which say basically there's no real role except a triggering role for what happens outside of the head in psychological explanations. You can't hold that view if you have a 4E view, I think. It's inconsistent. But you can hold on to the idea, something like the modular bit of that, the idea that you've got these internally rich structures, which are important for explanation. It's just that they're sort of they're rich, these rich structures that might be built in and that do serious work, might be domain specific in roughly Fodorian, the Fodorian sense, but sometimes they extend beyond boundaries of individuals, so they're themselves extended, they're extended modules. Okay, so I try and hold on to that. I'm not giving up the idea that there are these important structures, at least partly internal. It's just they're not even school internal. And then from the other book is this, a couple of other notions here, getting away from gene centrism that I think has been quite strongly represented in the philosophy of biology, away from essentialism about kind, so you adopt something like the homeostatic property cluster view, and embrace things like developmental systems theory, particularly extended developmental systems theory, in place of that emphasis on genetic agency. Some people, when they first saw this book, I think they read it more like genes are the agents of life. And it was just the opposite. It was like there are genes and then the things that are really the agents of life, like developmental systems or organisms, right? Or groups. These are the things that really drive biological sort of change and stability and generalizations. So these are things that make their way, and I have a whole chapter in Kin Matters, chapter 2, that try to pull out what I think is important in there. The book itself is structured into these three bits on relations, incest, and kinship. And I'm really, I'm going to give you a snippet from the stuff on kinship and a snippet from the stuff on incest, just to represent what's going on. So I've got this view progeneratism, just think reproduction is sort of important to the notion of kinship. And I've got an argument for it, very simple sort of argument. Kinship's governed by extended cognitive processes, right? So you get the extended cognition right in there. And then these extended cognitive processes distinctively rely on progenerative facts. Very simple two-premise sort of argument. So from that, I want to conclude kinship is least progeneratively constrained, reproductively constrained. Okay, this is the way, one way in which you can say reproduction's got to be central to the notion of kinship if both of these premises are true. So that's the two premises in the argument. And how do I try to unpack that? When I have a particular notion of kinship, I think that kinship is not completely unconstrained as a concept. It's not just what Marshall Sahlins calls mutuality of being or sense of belonging or who I think of as my kin. We often think about all sorts of individuals and groups as kin, even when they're not. I think you can talk, you talk about brothers in arms, for example, you use, we're sisters, Mother Earth. I think there's all this sort of language. Not all of it can be treated in a more derivative way, but a lot of it can, I think. And you've got to acknowledge that, like sometimes you might want to think of it in terms of it being metaphorical. I'm not saying that's the only move you can make, but it's not the primary sort of use. Primary uses have got to do with forms of belonging, mutuality being, that's intergeneration. Okay, and I think it is the most, it's the primary form that we have across all cultures. So that's what marks kinship of. And not just in us, but in other primates as well. And I claim that it operates in us through what I'm calling these like us detectors, which you can think of these like me detectors that you see in the developmental psychological literature. But the us here brings us into that social and normative realm. We've got to figure out different ways of thinking about what constitutes us, what are the groups that we're part of that we identify in terms of. The way they get deployed with respect to kinship, this intergeneration sort of structure, is through our sensitivity progenerative facts. So hence the link to the progenitor view of kinship that sort of is common in the book. So just to finish off this brief introduction here, what are progenitor facts? I know you're all anchoring to know they're deep things like this. Females are pregnant prior to giving birth. Newborns are young and dependent and relatively vulnerable, so require nurturance and protection for an extended period. Those who reproduce develop to adulthood and often themselves reproduce. Adults, those who reproduce and those whom they reproduce are sometimes alive at the same time. A female can give birth to multiple individuals over time. Okay, so I'm hoping you think they are at least facts, and they're facts that have something to do with reproduction. In fact, I want to claim that sort of basis for sort of concepts that we have in thinking about kinship, like pregnancy, care provision, development, notion of generations itself, and then finally the notion of siblings or sibling. Okay, and this is just a sample. There's going to be a whole mat of these kinds of facts that are under the heading of progenerative facts. So I'm claiming we have these sort of relatively low-level detectors that allow us to pick up on these sorts of things. That's why you find them across all different sorts of cultures, even if they're culturally elaborated on in different sorts of ways. Okay, so I think that's all I want to say about that. The middle part on incest avoidance, there's this sort of resurgence of interest that sort of peaked maybe 15, 20 years ago on the Westermarck effect. So I won't presuppose everybody knows what the Westermarck effect is, but I will also presuppose that many of you do. But basically it's the idea that, and it goes back to Edward Westermarck, who first articulated in 1891. He's the Finnish sociologist, philosopher who wrote The History of Human Marriage, a long-standing 6th edition work, published when he was 25, 600 plus pages. Now you have something to aspire to, graduate students, you know what you need to do. But it's the idea that, look, if you've got individuals that basically grow up together, they're not sexually attracted to each other. Okay, they're either averse or they're neutral or they avoid each other sort of sexually. So it's an empirical kind of claim. Right? And there's massive resistance to this claim amongst cultural anthropologists. Okay, they don't like that it refers to a putative biological mechanism, that's some sort of innate feature of people that's meant to explain all these things about incest. And I think they're just dead wrong. And part of the reason that I think that they're wrong about this is, you know, the essays collected in this volume, Inbreeding Incest and the Incest Taboo, which comes out of the evil Stanford Empire, unfortunately. But also the work by Bernie Chappé, a primatologist in Quebec, called Primeval Kinship, which got a lot of play starting about 15 years ago. And so what I try to do in the book is I try to provide a re-articulation of the Westermarck effect. As well as I'd say, look, there's a disposition that we share with other primates, I think we share it actually with all other primates, that links care-based attachment to behavioral sexual avoidance, and you can express it as a simple rule. If you develop care-based attachment with an individual during your or their childhood, experience sexual aversion towards that individual. And we can argue about whether it should be aversion or neutrality or lack of interest or whatever. But the things that I wanted to highlight here were the things in blue. Your or their childhood. This is an important, simple but important addition, because in the anthropological literature on incest avoidance, it's not exclusively, but predominantly on sibling incest. But the clinical reality of incest is it's predominantly intergeneration, unfortunately. And it's predominantly older males and younger, often children or close to children, teenage individuals, right, who are the ones who are the victims of those things. So when you have the focus on siblinghood, it sounds like this kind of like, yeah, having a bit of fun together or something like that, but that's not the clinical. of incest, and that's just left out altogether. So you need an account if you're going to have this mechanism, which is meant to be a mechanism, in Westermarck, that when you grow up together, it can't apply to adults and children because they don't both, the adults are already grown up. That's why you need to have a slight tweak on this. And also there's this experiential element that I think is critical that's left out, that reflects the lived reality of that. So, and that's important because that's going to restrict the application of this rule only to creatures that have a certain level of cognitive sophistication so they can have certain kinds of experiences. So I'm claiming in the book that you find this at least in the primate lineage. I'm not taking too much of it about where else you find it. So that allows me to run a kind of phylogenetic argument for the defense of this rule. Okay. So how this ties up with the broader themes, just briefly, is that I think that this Westermarck mechanism or the CASA mechanism that I'm articulating is an extended cognitive biocognitive social mechanism. So it draws on resources inside and outside of the individual. That's the way I think to pick out this notion of extension across the biological and cognitive sciences. So think of CASA as involving that. So that feeds into this modest nativist view. It's this sort of rich, technical term, structure that we have, but it doesn't involve thinking about the environment just as a triggering cause, because it's a developmental mechanism that takes many years to develop and lots of repeated sorts of experiences. And both us and other primates have them, partly in the first instance through mother-offspring bonding, through feeding, and there's many hundreds and hundreds of interactions that have to be built into that over time. Right? So it's this kind of temporal unfolding that's needed to establish that, and that's been one of the things of my work on cognitive extension. Okay. So it's not, it's misleading to think about it as being merely a genetically encoded adaptation. So this ties up with the non-redundant aspect of it. So coming back to the norming connection here, if there is one. So I had these three sorts of themes that I'm pulling out from boundaries. So what I'm claiming here is that on the conception that I'm developing and deploying in the kinship book, we think about cognition primarily as socially extended. So the extended systems here are ones that have other cognitive agents in them that are part of our social groups. And that's what gives it at least the potential to generate a certain kind of normativity. And then this feeds both the Prokian sense of belonging, those who are like us, for example, and also the account of incest avoidance, those who we shouldn't be having sex with, or we don't feel an attraction towards as that unfolds. So again, we think about kinship and incest avoidance both involving these extended biosocial cognitive mechanisms. Okay, on to the main show. Good. So let's talk about this literature on biological individuality and evolutionary transitions. So to start, here's something that's not from this book. It's actually from the Wikipedia page that summarizes that is on the book. And again, I'm not going to belabor this. I hope just mention it. There are these 8 different sorts of transitions, and most of the discussion of the literature has been in things like transition from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, okay, or from protists to multicellular organisms, okay. The stuff I'm interested in is right down at the bottom, from solitary individuals to colonies with non-reproductive castes, from primate societies to human societies with language-enabled means. Now, I don't think these are actual real transitions. That's part of, but I'm not going to argue that today. But they give you an idea of how Maynard Smith and Seth Murray were thinking about this 30 years ago. Okay, so this is a bit I'm going to fasten on to. There are 2 sorts of questions I think are actually in the abstract. How does reflection on practice of the norming of biological individuality interact with some recent literature? And I'm thinking about a special issue of the Proceedings B of the Royal Society that came out less than 2 years ago. How do they interact with that literature that considers both the human sociality forms and evolutionary transition and individuality? And then basically, is this kind of norming is introducing a distraction, or is it crucial to thinking more systematically here about human sexuality? Okay, so let's just take something from about 2/3 of the way through the book. That's what Maynard Smith and Seth Murray say about animal society. So to understand the origins of animal society, we must ask how individuals capable of reproduction came to cooperate to the extent that most of them lost the ability to reproduce. That's what they cast as a sort of central problem here. So clearly there's the focus on eusociality. Right, so just drawing attention, it strikes me as quite idiosyncratic because I think eusociality is a very special sort of adaptation, even though you find it across the Hymenoptera and the termites. So you've got some evolutionary divides there. It's widespread across wasp ants and bees, for example. It's still, there's a lot of them, but there's a lot more of other things that don't have eusociality. There's a lot more other forms of sociality that are out there. Anyway, I just need to flag this as something that strikes me as a little sort of odd here. And it also is a pretext for sort of just acknowledging the work of my own Brazilian PhD student. I know you're way past that now, but you can still accept that sort of label maybe with pride. Lucia Nico is on a postdoc plant cognition lab now in Murcia, who's come up with a new framework that I think helps to get away from some of these paradigm sorts of moves. We have paradigmatic sociality and so do you social insects, for example. Yeah, that's true. I talk about the superorganisms, you talk about other special sorts of cases of cells, but what you really need is you need a framework that allows us to move seamlessly between different sorts of taxa. So you might be talking about bacterial sociality, as many biologists do. You might be talking about group levels, so if you're moving across levels of organization. So being able to talk about that cooperation between the groups themselves, right? And the way in which people move to talk about group selection as well as individual selection. So she's done, I think, a really nice job of articulating that framework in terms of the notion of relationships. And currently we're looking at doing some stuff together on queer kinship that deploys it, the combination of this together with the stuff that I've been doing on kinship. So let's come back now to the end of major transitions just to set the scene of it. So when they're talking about the major changes that they're pointing us towards, they flag the origin of language, the invention of writing, and the change from societies dominated by magic and ritual to those in which science and reason play an increasing role. And all I want to say about this is that it clearly signals they're thinking about relatively recent changes. They're not talking about things that happened tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, which is what's happening in most of the other transitions. Okay? Nothing wrong with it, I'm just pointing that out from their own focus. And then this is actually, together, this is the last paragraph of the book. The very last thing they say, we're today in the midst of yet another major transition to a society in which information is stored and transmitted electronically. It's impossible to foresee where this late transition will lead, but emergence of computer viruses may be a straw in the wind. We must be beware that we're not replaced by a new kind of self-replicating ancestry entity. Now, this is a really interesting place to end the book and sort of leave you hanging what they've got in mind. We can talk about that, but again, they're clearly thinking about, I think, the development of maybe not artificial general intelligence per se, but things like that. I think this is the direction that there is already been sort of flagged here with electronic storage and transmission of information. So when I started working on biological individuals, there were a couple of chapters on organisms in Genes and the Ages of Life, chapters 3 and 4. And it's a very simple sort of framework. I thought the central notion was that of a living agent. I gave what I call a tripartite characterization of living agency, and I deployed the HPC view for that. But once you do that, you can see that organisms are really a central kind of biological individual, but so too are at least some parts of organisms and some groups of organisms. Very simple way to put this sort of together. And then you can sketch in this notion of living agents on this diagram to indicate that at least some biological individuals are also parts of organisms, and maybe some groups of organisms are also biological individuals. Okay. And then when we came to revise this, because I wrote the first, maybe I can't remember if it's the first, I think it's the first two versions of this in SCP. And then Matt Barker, who was a former master student of mine at Alberta, helped to add another thing like Darwinian individuals. You can imagine we put that in about 2010, 2011. For some reason, I don't know why, just people seem to be talking about it. It's the Godfrey Smith edition. And then we started to try and say, hey, we think we can actually place lots of key examples in different parts of this map here, which indicates that it's kind of more than just philosophers making up a nice picture or a not so nice picture. But you can also disagree, I think, where particular examples land here, right? So I think heart number 6 clearly lands in the, it's a part of an organism. I think it's a biological individual. Some people might say it's not a biological individual at all. Some people have said that, right? So my point is not that we are legislating with the diagram, we're providing a form of representation that allows people to express their views and then show what the disagreements would be. And you have to give reasons for why you locate something in one place rather than another on this. Okay. So that's, over the, I think we might have done 5 editions now, and the latest on this is Ellen Clark's latest, The Units of Life, which I haven't read in full. I've just browsed sort of through it. Unfortunately, last week Ellen was sick, so I didn't get to hang out with her and talk to her about it. But what was interesting to me, glancing through the book, and people who've really read it can tell me if this is the right view, is that organisms really become central to her discussion there, in a way in which I think they haven't in a lot of the rest of the literature on evolutionary transitions or on biological individuals. So that'll have to be for another time. In this recent edition, this revival of this focus on human society as a form of ETI, you've got this whole special issue that's edited by Carmel, Schmidt, Lamb, and Seth Murray himself. And you've got the introduction to it by Carmel, Human Society Development, is it evolutionary transition and individuality. Again, what you see is this reference that human society is linked to being a superorganism. Not much different on that front than we saw through this before. And in a paper a little bit further into that special issue, you also got this reference to full sociality as being some kind of peak or goal. And then there's this idea that, again, as we saw in the other Seth Murray and Megan Smith quote, that we're starting to exhibit these signs of another upcoming evolutionary transition in individuality. It's not just a thing that's in the past. So that made me think, okay, I can talk about things I think are relatively recent now and see how it plugs into this literature. So that's so much by way of background, but with so much background laid, the rest goes faster. Okay. So remember, what I'm going to do is suggest that there are these distinct practices of the norming of individuality that we can throw in here, and they've got this kind of what I'm calling antagonistic nature to them, and they're going to be encapsulated under this notion of eugenification. So note that both non-human and particularly human sociality are represented in this literature as generating some kind of higher individual following the other transitions. Each new level, you get a new kind of individual from what was existing in the previous level. And there has to be some kind of explanatory story, maybe a strict evolutionary story for why that transition sort of occurred, because it imposes a certain kind of cost on the existing individuals. And what I'm claiming is, at least in the case of human sociality, and it may be the case in some other forms of non-human animal sociality, this is mediated by psychology, by institutions, and by I'm calling the norming of individuality. And in the recent past, this kind of norming at its core has been antagonistic, and that antagonism sort of either, put more strongly, undermines the idea there could be an evolutionary transition here, or at least stands in tension with this idea of there being a higher level of individuality emerging. So, big claims, how do we defend them? So here's the general idea. That a fundamental form of norming individuals for us for the last at least hundreds of years has been to distinguish between at least 2 different kinds or sorts of individuals. Roughly speaking, the better and the worse. The fitter, or the fit, and the unfit. Okay, there's different ways to label, and then I'm not suggesting it has to be binary, but these are just simple sorts of examples. Okay, so it's classified in the first instance. I think it distinguishes between traits that people have. There's better and worse sorts of traits, and you unpack what better and worse mean, fit and unfit. But then I think it gravitates towards thinking about the kinds of people, the sorts of people themselves as having a fixed sort of nature. Okay. Let me give an example. So here's sort of classic eugenic family studies tree diagram that's from Estabrook's reworking of the 1877 book on the Dukes in 1915, where they start to add in these kinds of scientific representations. Where what's being represented in this picture, SX is it's a genetic representation of the sort of gene or something gene-like for sexual licentiousness. And the idea of the visual representation is it shows that this trait gets passed on through generations. And supposedly, and they want you to think, I think, roughly Mendelian kinds of ratios and so on, even though it's not strictly speaking true in this case, right? But that's the power of the visual representation to do that. So we see it as being intergenerational, it's being transmissible, and allows us to talk about licentious kinds of people, and therefore things that we need to do to those kinds of people if we don't want them around, or we want them to be less represented in future generations. Interestingly, you've also got a little A in here, which is for alcohol. alcoholics. And I don't know, it was a glitch in the printer, but there's only one of them in this whole thing. So maybe it doesn't run in families in the same way. But in classic eugenic literature, that's the idea, right? You find all of these negative traits represented in these traits like this. Okay. And it's because licentiousness and alcoholism are these negative traits. They're not ones that are sort of welcome, so the people who have them turn out to be undesirable sorts of people to have represented in your future generation. And so my claim is that once you get this general idea being put, you have to articulate a little bit more. That's the beginning to put into place particular sorts of norms that pose a challenge to having a fully integrated human sociality of the kind that plugs into the ETI literature. Could be my batteries, so I can decide whether to quickly. Oh, we're gonna. Oh, sorry. So the examples that I'll give, and I may not have time to talk about transhumanism really at all. But if I can quickly mention, I will. I'll talk about eugenification and racialization. So what's happened since I started thinking about this is in the last few months since I've been on leave, I've now written 7 chapters of this book with just 2 to go. That will probably be called Eugenification or Eugenification Plus. So in the session before this, we talked about the chapter on ancestry, and last week at Leeds I talked about the chapter on indigenous dispossession with graduate students there. But you can see the sort of list of other ones that are there. There could be another wish list of 10 other chapters. The idea is that once we think about what this process of eugenification is, we then think about something kind of interesting to reflect on and its relationship to that process. Okay, so it's not meant to be exhaustive, it's just meant to get people sort of revved up to think a little bit more about some of the things they might take for granted. So when we come back to thinking about eugenics and its relationship with fragile sciences, you can think about eugenics itself as a kind of emergent fragile science that cuts across all the biological, social, and cognitive sciences. If you look at particular areas that focus on the techniques that are adopted and so on. And I've been particularly concerned with the continuity and re-emergence of eugenic thinking after the end of what's sometimes called the explicit eugenic era in 1945. What do I mean by eugenics? I mean, sort of, I think what Galton meant by it's pretty much taken from Galton's definition in the footnote at the bottom of page 25 of the 1883 book, where he introduced the term. It's got a particular aim, which is to improve human lives across generations, not just improve them for now. And it has a particular way to do that by changing the mix of the population so you get more better and fewer worse people in that next generation. And you use the latest science and technology to do that, including inventing new technologies like surgical sterilization, which wasn't invented strictly for eugenics. It was invented to punish criminals in the 1880s, but it was quickly used to incorporate. IQ testing would be another example of this in the early part of the. It's not designed for that purpose, but quickly comes to be incorporated in what I call a process of eugenification. The work that I've done, as I've said, was with survivors like Lilani Muir, who won a lawsuit against the province of Alberta in 1995 for $750,000 for wrongful confinement and sterilisation, and her other friends and people she was in the institution with. There were 5 of them in this mix, together with other people who strongly identified with their history, even though they hadn't been through that same process of institutionalization, but were trying to parent in the wake of that kind of eugenic past in Alberta. We were finding they were told they shouldn't have children, they're having their children taken away from them, and so on. Of these people, I think 2, maybe 3 have an Indigenous background, but that wasn't a criterion for them being involved in what we did. The focus of sterilisation in Alberta as elsewhere was really on disability. And at times there were more Indigenous people sterilised in little pockets, but in some sense they were kind of spared the horrors of that because they were subject to different horror of the residential school system. Okay, and similar sort of story is true of Australia, but Australian history is quite different. The point here is that we end up running this public-facing project for 6 years, with about 4 years before we got off the ground, very much focused on the stories. It's what I call standpoint eugenics from the standpoint of those who are most deeply negatively affected by it. And very important to have every move in our project informed by these. Judy and Lilani at the top here were both on our governing board, for example. We actually had to fight with the funding agency, the federal funding agency, to have them on the board because they didn't meet their criteria. They weren't CEOs, they weren't presidents of universities, they weren't academic researchers. We said, but these are the people who actually really know about this stuff, right? But it went back and forth a little bit. But we were very happy to have that sort of focus. So you can still get onto the site, about half of it works. As I said, there are about 900 articles that drive it, and you can view them on different sets of tools. So what's eugenic thinking here? If we broaden out from, because you think eugenics has at least this component that's got to do with it being a social movement, there's a certain kind of currency and uptake and manifest in certain kinds of social policies and practices. Eugenic thinking is something a little bit more general, and it's what underlies that, I would say. So it's distinguished between all kinds of people in terms of their perceived desirable, undesirable traits, particularly those they're likely to transmit to future generations. Okay? And then, as I've said before, I think that this persists today and it structures lots of things, and that's in some sense what the thing is about. So in Australia, just a sort of side note, we didn't have sexual sterilisation. Lots of people were sexually sterilised, but it was extra legal. There weren't states there that had sex, and lots of states tried to pass them, including, as I found out, I haven't written this paper yet, but I've got some juicy stuff here on West Australia's close call, and particularly the Chancellor of the University of Western Australia was centrally involved in trying to get so-called mentally deficient people sterilised in the state, and it failed really for just luck of the draw. In Australia, though, eugenic thinking was manifest in at least these two other sorts of domains. Through the White Australia policy with respect to immigration, people usually acknowledge that immigration policies can be and often have been eugenic in their sort of nature, even if they had other sorts of goals. White Australia policy was one of the first, if not the first, policy that was passed by the new federation in 1901, but also, more importantly, or as important, forced child removal practices that resulted in stolen generations. But you can see that as eugenic, I think, only if you accept the idea of cultural eugenics. And when I first started touting this maybe a dozen years ago, I was a bit more tentative about it than I am now. I actually really think that it's hard to deny that there are cultural forms of eugenics. Because if you just go back to that characterization, that three-part characterization, you'll see all of those components. The only difference is you don't have a biological mechanism of intervention, you've got a cultural one. But that's happening in immigration. So if you're prepared to think that immigration, right, as being a form of eugenics, or involving eugenic thinking, then I think you've got to apply it in some cases. So when it comes to eugenic thinking and race, which I suspect is a particular interest of people here, it's not that race, race doesn't really appear in many sterilisation laws explicitly, but certainly in the background, it certainly plays a role in immigration and other places, marriage restriction laws, for example. So those laws involve what I call the eugenification of feeble-mindedness, mental deficiency, epilepsy, and sterilisation laws. But you see it sort of elsewhere, and I think racialization doesn't have to, but it does typically manifest this kind of eugenic thinking. So what do I mean by this magic eugenification sort of process? Let's just try and say that more explicitly. So you distinguish between people in terms of any of these, and you can add your own favorites if they're not here. Normal, abnormal, healthy, unhealthy, productive, unproductive, desirable, undesirable. At least those. You get finer subdivisions and so on. Other than that. And then you think about these groups as coming to manifest a cluster of relatively fixed traits that are transmitted by biological and cultural mechanisms. And so you start to think about the people like that as well. Okay. So here, the central sort of ultimate normative loading that's given is the contribution that those fixed kinds of people or sorts of people make to future generations. Okay, so that's the kind of currency of normativity here that's in play. So if that's the characterization of eugenification, very simple, essentially these two sorts of steps, then we can think about racialization. Does it fit under this heading, or could it? So then you have certain groups that are identified through visible features, audible features, or ascribed common ancestry, that is by skin color, for example, by language, or by geographical origins or DNA markers that you have. And then you start to think about these groups as manifesting a relatively fixed set of traits over time that get transmitted by biological or cultural mechanisms. Right? It's just kind of filling it in for this particular sort of case. And then these get differentially valued, right? Better and worse, more or less desirable classes. And so races get evaluatively ordered. Typical way in which they're ordered is through a hierarchy. If you look at the early racial theory in the 1750s to 1800, then you've got that sort of quite apparent in Blumenthal, Kant, others. I think even in Linnaeus, but I'm prepared to say that things might be trickier in Linnaeus. So I go back to our questions, just to get close to finishing up. So we've got these questions. Does how does this reflection on this kind of norming interact with this recent literature, and is it sort of a distraction or sort of crucial to that reflection? So what I'm suggesting is that racialization is a practice that's antagonistic to this idea of forming a higher individual, because you're kind of pitting better and worse people again, you're choosing between them in terms of social policies and direction and talking about their value. So it's hard to see how you get kind of high unified individuals through that process. And I would say that's true more generally of sort of eugenification. And the exception in both cases is that if your eugenification leads to the elimination of one of those sorts of people, or all of those, the worst people, then you can have a kind of unity. That's kind of brilliant. It's sort of a horrific kind of outcome if you think about it. So I'm not saying it couldn't be sort of done, and maybe that's the tendency, that's the vision that some people have when thinking about eugenification as a sort of good thing at the end of the day. Sorry, I don't know what So what I'm suggesting is that in the case of both racialization and eugenification, particularly related the way in which I'm suggesting they are, you end up with following thick descriptions of psychosocial processes and part of human sociality. And this is opposed to the kinds of thin descriptions that I think predominate in the ETI literature. So you have models which rely on much more generic sorts of notions like conflict and competition, and they rely on more generic psychological notions, things like in-group bias, similarity, matching, things like that. Now, the exact relationship between these is complicated, but I'm suggesting that we actually need to think about historical processes that have informed how we form groups to let us know about how we're likely to form human social groups down the track. That's part of the move here to move to and I'm suggesting that the picture is much darker than we usually think, and that I think is envisaged by people working on the ETI literature. Okay. So I can just stop now if you've got a couple of minutes. Okay, let's just talk about how I think this, just be to raise some questions about how this might connect to transhumanism. So Huxley is the person that's usually thought to have coined the term transhumanism, even though it's around in French about 10 years before. So he says the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself and its entire humanity. The end name of this new belief, transhumanism. Man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. And generally, it's this idea of using technological control and modification to overcome the limitations that are thought otherwise to be inherent to the sort of soft, squishy, temporary biological housing that we have. Okay, so often it's the body's seen as kind of the enemy and something to fight against. Not always in transhumanism, but it needs to be modified. And the sorts of things, if you look at the transhumanist sorts of projects, you see things like mind uploading as a key sort of technology. You see radical life extension to 300 years as being another kind of technology. Disease-free existence as another one. And a lot of those have to do with overcoming the limits of perishable soft tissue. Okay. So now, remember, go back to eugenification. Here's the characterization of the process, and just ask that question. Do, or could, if you like, transhumanist appeals invoke or rely on a kind of eugenification? Notice that transhumanism, even though I've given a very brief point at it, is a project of human melioration. It's a project of human improvement in the same way that I think eugenics is. But that doesn't mean that it's eugenic, because the crucial thing with eugenics is that means bit, right, by changing the balance of the population. So if it's going to be a form of if transhumanism and the advocacy and implementation of transhumanist goals is going to fall under this heading of eugenification, it's got to demonstrate that second bit as well. Okay, and I'm not pretending that I've even tried to show that here. But that's the direction I think you would need to go if you wanted to follow through this with a positive sort of answer. Okay, so just to sort of finish, sort of reasons for why I think the answer might be yes to this in some sorts of cases. If you look at how you can certainly see eugenic thinking as filtering through a lot of work on reproductive autonomy and new technologies for reproduction in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the wake of the Human Genome Project and this idea of eugenics. Okay, and transhumanists often, there are two big things they appeal to. One is genetic enhancement, and the other is artificial general intelligence. So in the longer version, the chapter version of this, I have a bit more to say about AGI and why I think it's also is likely to involve a kind of eugenification, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. So there's a lot of emphasis on gene editing, for example. So when Nick Bostrom, who's a leading figure in this area 20 years ago, gives a sort of summary of what we might do, he sort of says, look, we can enhance the positive traits and through gene editing, and we can sort of ameliorate the negative traits as well. But it's probably going to be easier to do something about the negative things. And he names 4 of them: Tay-Sachs, Lesch-Nyhan, Down syndrome, and early onset. And he presents in a way in which this is going to be sort of equalizing and is motivated by egalitarianism. Now, that's what I call part of the transhumanist ideology, the seller. The reality in practice, definitely, we're not going to, these are not the folks who are going to be saved. These are the folks who are going to be eliminated. And you can partly, I mean, an induction from a case of one history of eugenics is maybe not strong, but I think there's actually further evidence that would support that sort of claim. So you can actually look at, what it would take for these to be sort of fixed through CRISPR Cas9 gene editing, and they actually don't have the right kind of profile to admit of that for different sorts of reasons in each of the different cases. So that's the longer case that I'm trying to make in the full version. So the bottom line, if you follow down that line of thinking just about that aspect of genetic enhancement, is that we've got this idea of what eugenification is. And there are 2 different sorts of ways in which transhumanist proposals could involve it. And I just described the one at the level of practices, but just in those very first sorts of moves, and this is kind of has an affinity with how I was talking about ancestry in the group before as well. So just in thinking about what are the basic categories that get fed into our thinking about what's possible here on the positive or negative front here, I think that it's very likely, given our past, that we're going to buy into a eugenification process in the kinds of categories that we sort of invoke. And if they do on either of these, then the way you maintain social level individuality is primarily going to be through exclusion and elimination, just like what happened in eugenics. Okay, so it's kind of a dismal kind of conclusion in some ways. So take it or leave it. That's where I think I'm going to be going with this. Thanks a lot.